Here's some news that should concern all of us. A scientific paper published this week found that almost unbelievable levels of microplastics and nanoplastics are making their way into our brains. Dr. Matthew J. Campen is one of the paper's co authors, and he's here to discuss the findings of his study. Dr. Campen is a toxicology professor at the University of New Mexico. He's also the director of the New Mexico Center for Metals in Biology and Medicine and has authored over 100 peer reviewed publications, largely in the area of cardiovascular effects of inhaled pollutants. All right, Dr. Campen, thank you so much for being here. And I thought we should start by having you explain exactly what microplastics and nanoplastics are.
Sure. Katie, thanks so much for having me on. The degradation of plastics that we use all the time is something that takes years, decades. We throw things away, and they break down. There's a slow chemical process. Part of what makes plastics wonderful is that they're very resilient and durable. We can use them for a long time, but eventually they break and they become shards, and those shards get smaller and smaller. So when we say microplastics, we're using the metric scale. So if you think of centimeter, um, we get down to micrometers, which is really too small to be seen by the human eye, but even smaller than that is nanometers. So the distinction between a microplastic and a nanoplastic essentially is whether it's bigger or smaller than 1 micrometer. And what I'll say is what we've observed in the brains and in the other organs is these nanoplastics that are about 100 to 400 nanometers in length and sort of skinny. They look like flakes, and um, they're about the size of a couple of viruses laid side by side. So it gives you the idea of scale. They're very, very tiny and definitely throughout the body.
And I know microplastics are everywhere these days. We keep hearing about them. But what impact do they have on our bodies? Because I've heard about them getting into all kinds of places, even in the placentas of unborn children, right?
We we've published a few of those studies, and in fact, we had a press release recently from a colleague at Baylor College of Medicine, Enrico Barroso, who showed that there might be a link between preterm birth and the exposures to these plastics. We are just at the cusp of understanding what these things might be doing in our bodies. We are still struggling with the technologies to detect them. We're still struggling with getting the right tissue samples in the right patients. So it's going to be a while before we are really confident about the health outcomes, the diseases that might be caused or exacerbated by these plastics. Um, right now, there's a hint from a group in Italy, Raffaele Marfella and his team in the spring of this last year showed linked to cardiovascular disease that was pretty alarming, but it was also associative. Same with our study showing a link with high levels in Alzheimer's patients. Very associative. Too soon to put a confident statement that this is causing any diseases.
Right. And I read that people with dementia or Alzheimer's often have a thinner blood brain barrier. So they're likely to have more microplastics and nanoplastics travel to their brain. So it's hard to say if that was a cause or if it was just the result of a thinner blood brain barrier that is present in those kinds of patients. Let's talk about the study in particular, how many brains you studied and from what years and what you found.
Sure. So we worked with the Office of the Medical Investigator here in New Mexico to obtain cadaver samples, decedent samples, and we looked at liver, kidney, and brain from um, different time periods. 2016, and then we got additional samples from 2024. Um, the number of brains we looked at was 28 in 2020 and 2016, and then 24 in 2024. We felt that that was not enough just of a time frame. So we also reached out to a colleague at Duke University, Andrew West, and he had a stockpile, essentially a repository of samples that span from 1997 to 2013. So we were able to look at these. These are all otherwise normal individuals, and we used a analytical approach called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. It's
Oh,
very
yes, I've heard of that, Matt.
exactly. If you want to bring a scientist on your show, Katie, you're going to get this,
Speak
right?
English, though, Matt.
So it's a way of measuring polymers. It's really cool. It's very new. It's not yet a gold standard, and so that's a caveat we want to share is when we looked at this over time, we definitely saw a trend. We're very confident that that trend is real and that plastics in the brain as well as in the liver are getting they're increasing over time. When we talk about the absolute level of plastics in the brain, it's quite high by our measurements. We want to caveat that. We want to caution against overinterpretation of that value because we do need to consider that there's assumptions in how we measured it that may mean we're overestimating or underestimating the concentrations.
So your ability to measure has gotten better. So, having said that, is it accurate to say, Matt, that you found the concentration of microplastics in brains rose by about 50% from 2016 to 2024? Now, whether that means you're better at measuring remains to be seen, but damn, that's pretty alarming.
Um, it is alarming, and when we sit back, we've been looking at this data for a long time since we submitted this paper almost a year ago, really. Maybe it's not that unexpected. You know, this is what's happening in the environment. We've, since the 1950s, every 10 to 15 years, the amount of plastics we've produced has doubled. If it does get into the body, why would it not trend in the same pattern?
Well, one of the reasons it wouldn't, one would think, and I'm not a doctor or a scientist, but I learned a lot about the blood brain barrier when my late husband was diagnosed with cancer and he started to develop mets in his brain. And, I know the blood brain barrier protects the brain from toxic things and viruses alike. And so it's pretty capable of, right, keeping nasty stuff away from your brain. And what does it mean that these microplastics and nanoplastics and these tiny, tiny particles are able to get through that blood brain barrier and lodge in our brains?
It's a great question. The analogy I like to share is that your entire brain got to the other side of your blood-brain barrier somehow.
Right.
Your brain takes up materials as it needs it. It's a very controlled process. It typically is taking up things at a molecular basis, but it can also take gulps. We hypothesize, and we have a limited amount of data to support this, but we're diving in on this in the lab. We hypothesize that these plastics, these nano-sized plastics, travel with our fats that we ingest. So if you've ever cleaned out a Tupperware that had butter or bacon grease, you know it's going to take a lot of hot water and soap to get that clean. Plastics and fats just love each other. So when you eat fats, your gut forms them into these little balls that you absorb. They're called chylomicrons. Typically, those get absorbed by the liver, but also they go to the rest of the body. So it could be that either the chylomicrons or some of the other cholesterol lipoproteins that we create in the liver could be carrying those to the brain, and they're being pulled in mass across the blood-brain barrier. We don't know. I'm throwing out this mostly as a hypothesis to hopefully engage some other scientists to research this and help us confirm or deny some of the observations we have.
So you're saying, so you got me at fats and plastics love each other. So is that to say that we shouldn't store fatty stuff in Tupperware?
No, and I think there's been a lot of sort of urban myth, if you will, around the idea that fresh plastics are what the cause of this is. I'm gonna hold up my prop at this point. This plastic bottle is not a problem for me. It's a problem for my grandchildren, should I ever be so lucky. Um, I could weigh this bottle empty. I could fill it and empty it 10,000 times with water, weigh it again, and that weight would be basically just the same.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, I'm going to throw this out, and it's going to degrade over the next 10 to 20 years into nanoplastics. And the entire mass of this will eventually be nanoplastics in the environment. So, uh,
So how are we going from all this waste, right? And I've been on beaches covered in plastic pieces, large and tiny. How does it go from a nano or microplastic to actually going into our bodies?
well, I mean, we see plastics on the beaches and in drainage areas all the time because that's where they accumulate. But where is all the plastic? It's in landfills, right? We've buried, I mean, there's 8 billion tons of plastic on this earth. About half of it's already been discarded. I mean, 8 billion tons is 1 ton per human on the planet. Half of that, 500 kilograms or about 1,000 pounds, is just in waste, and so that's breaking down. It probably gets into groundwater. It probably gets into rivers and into ultimately the agricultural pathways as we irrigate. That's my big concern. I think there's limited evidence at this point. There's a great paper out of Switzerland that shows, wow, there's really a lot of this moving into the agricultural soils. That's compelling, as well as we're starting to measure this in meats, chicken and ham and things like that. We see them. So we think we're just putting them right back into our own mouths.
So it's more lower down the food chain than me. I know that I don't use plastic cutting boards anymore, for example, and I try to avoid plastic containers and things like that. But you're saying it's really literally downstream where most of this is happening.
Yeah, and it's a little depressing because there's not as much that individuals can do about this as a result. These nanoplastics that we're seeing inside the body are not something that you create with a cutting board. The cutting board, I mean, I've read the study. It creates things that are little particles of plastic that are like 80 microns, 80 micrometers. You
Hmm.
poop those out. They they're not going to get absorbed easily into the body. Whereas these nanoplastics are clearly in the livers and kidneys and the brains that we've looked at. Um, so it is concerning, and this is kind of an inflection point in our science to now say, wait a minute, maybe we've been focusing on the wrong thing. I would agree the microplastics, the big things are right to look at for the environment. Where are these? They're in the oceans, they're in animals, they're in Svalbard and the Arctic. Um, but when we're looking at the human body, I think we now need to start, really making an effort to understand how these super tiny things are distributing and causing illness potentially.
That it's been mentioned that microplastics might be behind the increase in cancer rates, particularly in colon cancer and breast cancer among people who are under the age of 50. Scientists are really trying to understand why this increase is happening. Given your depth of knowledge, Matt, have you seen any evidence that they may be contributing to cancer rates?
There's some compelling evidence, yes. Um, my sort of litmus test is to look at the epidemiology and just ask, are diseases going up over time, just like the plastics are? And there's a few things that are compelling, and that trend with cancer rates for people under the age of 50, early onset colorectal cancer, has been going up since 1994. It's such a weird and clear inflection point. Um, there's other things like multiple sclerosis. I just saw an interesting trend that it's not so much the epilepsy rates are going up, but mortality from epilepsy has been going up pretty steeply for the last 10 years. So hopefully other people are starting to pay attention and think about these in the context of the environmental exposures, especially microplastics that continue to increase unabated.
I want to get back to your study if I could and just ask you a few more questions, Matt, about that. You found that brain samples had 7 to 30 times as many microplastics in them as liver and or kidney samples. And I'm curious why you think in these cases the microplastics were gravitating to the brain.
Two things, maybe even three things, really make it a good home, if you will, for plastics. Assuming they get past the blood-brain barrier, which I appreciate. Nobody, nobody just takes that on merit. Um, the brain has a super high metabolism. It's the number one metabolic organ in the body, and it needs food like the what you might find in the lipoprotein particles. So that's one thing. The other thing is the brain has the highest fat content of any organ in the body that isn't fat. The dry weight of the brain is about 60% fat. The dry weight of adipose, which contains fat, is about 80%, but other organs are much lower. So we think it's going there for those two reasons. The other aspect is not much like clearance from the brain is difficult. Once you're in the brain, it's hard to get out. So that we think
Mm,
accumulation because of that. Whereas the liver and kidney, they're designed for clearance. And
right.
images we have in this paper, it kind of hints to the idea that at least from an anatomical standpoint, the particles we're seeing are in the places where we expect the clearance to be happening.
Tell us what you found about where these particles are traveling to. They're deep into the brain, aren't they?
Yeah, we in this study we found them in the prefrontal cortex. That was the specific, or not the prefrontal, but the frontal cortex. That was a specific region. So that's the front of the brain. It's mostly white matter. That seems to be where most of the thinking goes on, and that's sort of the region that makes us human, right? That's the part that's evolved from the inner brain. That's what we call the lizard brain.
Right.
Um, so that's concerning. Studies we're doing now, looking sort of at distribution throughout the whole brain, we can find them everywhere. We can visualize them with the transmission electron microscopy, so very clearly finding these things. We're starting to look at do they prefer spaces in the brain? Like are they more in the white matter than the gray matter? Are they more in the hypothalamus or the basal ganglia? Those are important questions we're addressing, but that study is still going on. It's really it's an engaging study, and Marcus Garcia, one of the co-first authors, is really leading that. So I'm excited to see what results come out of his work.
And what about the patients with dementia or Alzheimer's? Some of the brains that you studied had that, right? Or the people had suffered from Alzheimer's or dementia. Did you see a higher concentration of microplastics in their particular brains?
Absolutely. We saw um, about 5 times higher concentrations in the dementia brains. And it comes back to that concern about the blood-brain barrier. We really think that there's just greater access, easier access for the plastics to cross into the brain in those patients.
Because generally people with dementia have thinner blood-brain barriers that are easily or make it easier for these toxins to pass through.
Exactly. Bigger spaces in the fence posts.
So, can you draw any conclusions about microplastics causing various neurological impairments?
Absolutely not. We have to find out. There's several aspects of neurological diseases that are compelling. So, our colleague, another author on this paper, Andrew West at Duke, has shown that it's this protein called synuclein that is that can aggregate, and when it aggregates, it becomes the basically the seed for neurodegeneration and dementia as well as Parkinson's. Synuclein is very clearly associated or causal in that regard. So he's shown, and these are not in the body, but in laboratory experiments, he's shown that the nanoplastics can cause this to happen, this aggregation. So we think that there's a reason, there's a mechanism that the plastics might cause something, but we're at nowhere near the point where we can say that confidently.
Do you think enough is being done to study this issue? Obviously, scientists like yourself, you've mentioned several others from important institutions, but Do you think there is a level of concern about this that there should be?
Um, I appreciate that it's growing. I've had conversations with the director for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. He is concerned and he's taking this to Congress, Rick Wojcik. I've had conversations with the CEO for SC Johnson. Fisk Johnson is concerned about this, and there are people who are starting to pay attention and motivate change and motivate resources to do something about this. So I don't think it's where it needs to be, but I'm glad to see attention being brought forward. I was pleased that Senator Merkley from Oregon took the time to share our preprint. This was a couple weeks ago before was officially released, but he held it up and he put it into EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin's hands and said, you need to read this stuff. So we're confident that people are paying attention. That's great. We definitely need more resources for research. We also need to start bringing, the cooler heads to the table to start creating effective policy.
I want to ask some questions that my followers wanted me to ask you, Matt. One is, how do you know if you have this buildup of microplastics? Are there symptoms, any symptoms we should be on the lookout for? Or are there any tests that people can get done to indicate this? Or are we far from that point?
We're really far from that point. I certainly, I don't know of any health effects, and I certainly don't know of any symptoms that one might have as a result. Um, there are tests available out there. It's a little bit of snake oil salesman, though. I would really ask people to be cautious and skeptical about things you can find online, especially if you find like treatments that say they can clear microplastics from your body. I think there's a lot of people trying to make money off of this. Um, so just be cautious.
In fact, the next question, is there any evidence that our bodies/brains can rid themselves of the plastics that are currently there? I think you made the point with things like kidneys and livers, right? That they are designed to flush out impurities and toxins. But once it gets into the brain, there's really no place for it to go.
Right. Well, and yet it does eventually leave. It might be a slower process. One of the really optimistic aspects of our study, even though over time the plastics in the environment and in our body are going up, your age does not seem to predict the amount of plastics you have. So older people in older samples in our study had just the same amount or no different amounts from samples from younger subjects. So it really does suggest that we hit an equilibrium. We hit this balance point where the stuff coming in equals the stuff going out, and our bodies really are clearing. And I love to talk about this really cool study with fish where they put plastics in the water that the fish were swimming in, and they could show that the amount of plastics went up slowly and eventually leveled off in those fish. And when they moved the fish to an area where they weren't being exposed, it started going down. But if you put the fish in tanks with more and more plastics, then the body burden did go up in relationship to that concentration. So I think it's analogous with what we're seeing in this study in humans. We do remove it from our body, and if we can remove it in the environment, our bodies will take care of it.
How can people minimize their exposure to microplastics? I think there's very little chance, sadly, it sounds like, that people can swim in a plastic-free tank like those fish. So are there things that you can do given that they are so insidious and seem to be making their way through the food chain?
Insidious is the best word, and unfortunately, I can't think of any solid recommendations. A lot of what's out there relates to the bigger microplastics that we just don't think are the important factors, the important particles that are getting into the body. Um, Limiting meats in your diet is probably the most effective way to limit the amount of plastics you're getting. I don't have data to support that other than we've done a few studies. We had high school students come in over the summer, do a little internship, and they measured the amount of plastics that we'd see in chicken and ham and eggs and things like that. And it appeared that there was more in meats and animal-based products. So I'm not vegetarian or vegan, but I think it's wise to limit the ingestion of meats if that's a concern of yours. Um, but I think even more important is that we as a country and we as a global community start taking broader actions to manage waste and limit the generation and use of plastics.
The final question is, in fact, are there everyday products to avoid? Water bottles, detergents? What can we do at home to limit our exposures to microplastics? And again, you would say this is not really the problem.
It's not, and yet don't
Well,
use
I guess it is because, as you said, it's a problem for our grandchildren. So the less plastic we consume, the less plastic waste there'll be. But in terms of immediate health ramifications, it's not really from using, a plastic food container or things like that. It's what happens later.
yeah, exactly. So I strongly urge people to be conscientious of the types of plastics they use, get rid of single-use things, get use a metal container for your water, reuse it all the time. The other thing is, people buy into this idea of, well, I can use a water filter. Well, that's just kicking the can, isn't it? Because you're going to use a plastic water filter that weighs probably 10 times the amount of plastics you're ever going to remove from the water stream. So you're basically just creating more plastics waste for your grandchildren to deal with later. So I think a lot of sustainability is not well appreciated in this area, and that needs to be communicated better. We're making choices now to protect ourselves that are not long-term solutions for the rest of the world.
Or down the road for future generations. Dr. Matthew Campen, thanks so much for talking with us about your important work and keep us posted on future findings. It's really interesting.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate you covering this and reaching out to us.